Since the time of the Soviet Union, Russia's media and information control tactics have been closely scrutinized, and to some degree, information in Russia has never been totally free. However, the creation of the internet fundamentally changed how Russian citizens could access information, what information they could access, and to what extent the government could control that information. So, with that in mind, what steps has the Russian government taken to censor the internet in recent years? They've taken quite a few steps to limit internet freedom with a number of laws, and it looks like that's just going to continue into the future. The internet emerged in Russia in the late 1990s, but it took a while to gain popularity, as this graph shows. The blue line represents the number of Russians who use the internet one or more times per week. And as you can see, it doesn't hit the 50% mark until 2012. The number of Russians using the internet has continued to increase since then and will most likely continue to increase into the future. As you can also see from this graph, the number of Russians who have never used the internet is decreasing steadily. Although internet seemed like a new medium beyond control or regulation by the state that may present a threat, Vladimir Putin was initially surprisingly undisturbed and indifferent about internet use. He even made comments about the internet being mostly porn anyway, and in his first 2 terms as president, between 2000 and 2008, he did nothing to limit or censor the internet. This rhetoric, of course, could have just been his way of trying to keep Russian citizens uninterested in the internet. Also, the ignoring of the internet and refusal to censor it was a good way for Russia to appear to the outside world to be democratic, at a time when the internet wasn't even a threat to Russian peace, since the population didn't seem interested. The indifference toward the internet on the government's part began to change in 2011, when protests began in Russia, and many blamed the internet as the cause of those protests. In December 2011, protests began in the streets over the unfair parliamentary elections that had just taken place. Unfair elections were nothing new in Russia, but what was different this time is how many people had access to the information of the fraud. People used social media and other internet platforms to spread the information of the fraud, and they were able to see firsthand the corruption involved in the election, like the stuffing of ballot boxes. People were also able to use social media and internet platforms to coordinate the protests, which were the largest seen in Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. The protests that arose made it very clear to Putin and the Kremlin that a fundamental change needed to be made, and that the available information on the internet and the opinions the internet allowed to be voiced needed to be controlled to some degree. A crackdown on internet freedom began soon after the 2011 and 2012 protests, when the Blacklist Law was passed on November 1, 2012, and more laws and restrictions have continued to go into effect ever since. Here, a timeline of the different internet laws is shown. The Blacklist Law that I mentioned earlier officially blacklisted any sites that involve child pornography, encouraging suicide, or encouraging or dealing with illegal drugs. In 2013, the law was amended to include extremist material, and the interpretation of extremist material was very loose and pretty much allowed for any website with anti-government sentiments on the internet to be shut down. In February 2014, the Roskomnadzor, the agency responsible for regulating and overseeing the internet, was given the power to block any websites that were considered extremist without the approval of the court. In May 2014, a law called the Bloggers Law was passed, and it required any blogs with more than 3,000 viewers a day to register with the state. Included in this was social media accounts. It also required that social media data be stored in Russia and accessible by the Russian government. In June 2014, the Russian government went even farther in their limitation of internet freedom when they passed what has become known as the Law Against Retweets. This law, like it sounds, says that individuals can be punished for just sharing things that are considered extremist, even if they did not write the things themselves. Yekaterina Voloskynyeva, found herself in violation of this law against retweets in December of 2014, when after sharing a few things critical of the Kremlin and from Ukrainian sources with her 52 friends on the Russian equivalent of Facebook, her apartment was raided. She was charged with inciting hatred of volunteers fighting in Ukraine and of Russian authorities. Her trial began in October, and she faces up to 4 years in prison. Since then, laws have been passed with the aim of eliminating foreign control of the internet. All of these laws show how clearly internet freedom has been restricted by making pretty much any anti-government talk on the internet subject to the vaguely worded laws. Putin, however, has gone further than just limiting or censoring unfavorable internet contact. He has begun to try to actively control the minds of the Russians with what are called internet trolls. The job of these trolls is to cloud and inundate Russian internet sources with information and opinions that support Russia and Putin and are opposed to the West. This is the building in St. Petersburg where these trolls operate. Their job is to do things like leave comments on videos or articles that support Russia or tear down the West, from different accounts and in different languages. Such measures from an outsider and Western perspective seem unsettling. But what do the Russians think? Well, almost 50% are okay with internet censorship. This is because they think that the people who are dissenters on the internet are destabilizing Russia, and in addition, that the internet has too many foreign influences. So although internet censorship and control in Russia has increased to a degree that we in the West find unacceptable, apparently the Russian people themselves are fine with it. And furthermore, most Russians don't get their primary information from the internet, but rather from TV or radio and other sources that are controlled by the Russian government. The frightening thought this leaves us with, though, is that if the Russians can't turn to the internet as a source for views opposing those on government-controlled platforms, then the Russian government has the chance to control and shape the opinions of Russians to an alarming degree because of their ability to limit and make one-sided the information available to Russians.